Women are broke, and the men who once covered the gaps have walked away with no intention of returning to foot the bill. For years, the story sold to everyone was that women could build lives of complete independence and that men would still show up when it mattered because that is what men do. The message was clear that traditional roles were outdated and that women deserved the freedom to chase careers and personal fulfillment without needing to factor in partnership or family as the central priority. Men absorbed that message without much public complaint and responded in the only way that made sense to them by quietly removing themselves from the equation. They stopped volunteering their time and resources for relationships that felt one sided. They stopped playing the role of provider and protector when the cultural script kept telling them those roles were toxic and unnecessary. The result is a split that now defines daily life for millions. Single men have built routines that prioritize their own rest and their own goals, and they report higher levels of daily satisfaction than they felt when they were still trying to meet expectations that kept moving. Women who followed the advice to treat men as optional or even as obstacles are now discovering that the independence they were promised comes with full responsibility for every bill and every problem with no backup plan waiting in the wings. The economy has not helped the situation because prices for food, housing, and energy have climbed, while wage growth in the private sector has stayed flat for large parts of the population. Women who once viewed financial pressure as something a date or a husband would ease are now facing those pressures alone, and the old assumptions about male behavior are no longer holding. If you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos, you can show support by clicking the join button below and becoming a channel member to show support and gain access to exclusive videos for channel members only. The shift did not happen overnight, and it did not come from one single event, but from years of steady pressure that finally reached a breaking point. Men were told for a generation that their natural instincts to protect and provide were problems that needed fixing. Schools and media repeated the idea that masculinity itself was something to be softened or apologized for, and that women were held back only because men refused to step aside. Instead of arguing the point in public forums, many men simply adjusted their lives so that those messages no longer applied to them. They learned to generate income through skills that did not require an office or a boss looking over their shoulder. They built physical strength at home with basic equipment rather than expensive memberships that came with social expectations. They studied how money moves in markets and practiced small scale trading or online ventures that could grow without needing a large initial investment. They reduced their possessions to what actually served a purpose and found that the reduction in clutter also reduced the mental load that comes with constant consumption. The outcome is a group of men who wake up without an alarm because they no longer have to rush to a job that drains them just to maintain a lifestyle that was never truly theirs. They eat when they are hungry rather than on a schedule dictated by someone else. They sleep through the night because there is no argument waiting for them when they get home. They spend their free time learning or resting or pursuing hobbies that add to their life instead of subtracting from it. This is not a dramatic rejection of all connection, but a practical decision that the old deal no longer offered enough return for the effort required. When the cost of participation keeps rising, while the respect and appreciation keep falling, the rational response is to stop participating, and that is exactly what has taken place on a scale large enough to change the dating market and the marriage market at the same time. Women were given a different set of instructions during those same years, and they followed them in large numbers. The promise was that career achievement and personal autonomy would deliver fulfillment, and that any gaps could be filled by government programs or by the continued willingness of men to provide support even when the relationship was no longer mutual. Many women built impressive professional lives, and they were celebrated for doing so. The cultural message was that this path was not just viable, but superior, and that any woman who chose family as the primary focus was settling or missing out. The difficulty arrived when the economy tightened and when the social safety nets prove thinner than advertised. Government assistance covers basic survival for some, but it does not replace the shared resources and the daily cooperation that came from a functioning household. It does not provide the emotional steadiness that allowed previous generations to weather job loss or health setbacks without total collapse. It does not create the sense of long term security that comes from knowing another adult is invested in the same future. When inflation pushes the cost of groceries and rent higher each year, the gap between what assistance provides and what actual life costs becomes impossible to ignore. Women who were raised to believe that men would always be available as a backup are now seeing that availability disappear. The same cultural voices that told men their contributions were not needed are now surprised when men take that message seriously and build lives that do not include those contributions. Social media has made the surprise visible because platforms reward visible emotion. And the emotion on display right now is often shock mixed with anger that the expected rescue is not arriving. Posts asking where the men have gone or complaining that dates no longer involve the old gestures of provision are common. The tone in many of those posts reveals the underlying assumption that men were supposed to keep playing their assigned role no matter what the culture said about them. That assumption is being tested in real time, and the test is not going well for the people who counted on it. The economic layer makes every other problem sharper because money touches every part of daily existence. When prices rise faster than income, the first things to go are the small comforts and then the larger ones. For women who built budgets around the idea that a partner would contribute to housing or transportation or vacations, the adjustment is abrupt. They are not competing with other women for the attention of men who want to spend. They are competing with other women for limited public resources that were never designed to function as a full replacement for family level support. A single month of higher grocery bills or an unexpected car repair can wipe out whatever small cushion existed. The people who designed the current system assumed that men would continue to subsidize it through taxes and through direct spending in relationships. That assumption is breaking because the men who are opting out are also reducing their overall consumption in ways that affect the broader economy. They are not buying engagement rings or funding elaborate weddings. They are not purchasing homes sized for families they do not plan to have. They are not maintaining two sets of everything because there is no second person in the household. The money they keep stays in their accounts or goes into skills and tools that further increase their independence. This creates a feedback loop where the group that is opting out becomes more stable over time, while the group that expected continued support becomes more fragile. The stability is not flashy, and it does not make headlines, but it shows up in lower stress levels and in the ability to say no to situations that would have been accepted in the past. A man who can cover his own modest rent and his own food and still have time left over does not feel the same pressure to accept a relationship that adds more problems than it solves. That freedom of choice changes the power balance in every interaction that follows. Marriage has become one of the clearest places where the split shows up in concrete terms. Men who are already inside those arrangements are watching the same patterns play out at home, and many are reaching the same conclusion that the cost has exceeded the benefit. When a marriage becomes another source of financial drain and emotional management rather than a source of mutual support, the decision to leave starts to look like simple arithmetic. The man who walks away can often rebuild his finances faster than expected because he removes the second set of expenses and the constant negotiation over spending. He can move to a smaller place or even a shared arrangement that would have been unacceptable before. He can direct his income toward debt reduction or skill building instead of toward maintaining appearances. Within a year or two, many of these men report having more cash on hand and more control over their time than they had during the marriage. The woman who remains often faces the opposite situation. She may keep the house, but the house comes with a mortgage sized for two incomes. In a market where selling is difficult and prices are soft, she can end up trapped with payments she cannot meet alone. The furniture and the lifestyle that came with the marriage do not generate income. The legal system that was designed under different assumptions about who would provide can leave her with the larger share of the remaining obligations, while the man who left has fewer obligations and more flexibility. This is not a strategy that most men announce in advance. It is the result of reaching a point where continuing to subsidize a situation that no longer works makes less sense than accepting the short term loss and starting fresh. The pattern is repeating often enough that it has become visible in divorce statistics and in the changing living arrangements of adults in their 30s and 40s. The deeper issue is that many women were never taught how to operate in an environment where special treatment based on gender is no longer automatic. Previous generations of men absorbed shocks and absorbed costs so that the women and children in their lives did not have to feel the full weight of economic or social difficulty. That buffering created a reality where the harder edges of competition and scarcity stayed hidden for large parts of the female population. When that buffer is removed, the learning curve is steep because there was no practice at managing scarcity without assistance. The skills that matter in a tight economy are the ones that involve delayed gratification and direct problem solving. Those skills were de emphasized in favor of narratives that framed any difficulty as evidence of systemic unfairness rather than as a normal part of adult life. The result is a generation that knows how to express frustration but has less experience turning that frustration into sustained action that changes material conditions. Men who walked away had to develop those skills because no one was buffering their outcomes. They learned to live on less because living on more required participation in systems that no longer rewarded them. They learned to fix things themselves or to do without because paying someone else was no longer an option they could sustain. That difference in preparation shows up when the same economic pressure hits both groups. The group that already practices minimalism and self reliance absorbs the shock with less visible distress. The group that expected the old protections experiences it as a crisis that feels personal and sudden, even though the underlying trends have been visible for years. What makes the current moment different from earlier periods of economic strain is that the social contract itself has changed. In past downturns, the assumption was still that men and women would pull together in pairs or in families to weather the difficulty. That assumption no longer holds because too many men have already tested the alternative and found it preferable. They are not waiting for conditions to improve so they can re enter the old arrangement. They are building lives that do not depend on those conditions improving. This removes the pressure that used to force renegotiation inside relationships. When one side can simply exit without catastrophic personal cost, the leverage that used to exist disappears. Women who still believe that men will eventually return to the old roles are operating on information that is no longer accurate. The men who left did not leave because of one bad experience or one difficult partner. They left because the overall calculation no longer made sense across multiple experiences and across the cultural messages they received every day. Rebuilding that calculation would require more than policy changes or economic improvement. It would require a cultural shift that restores genuine respect and mutual investment, and that shift has not occurred. The absence of that shift is what keeps the walk-away pattern in place, even as conditions tighten for everyone. The practical consequences are already visible in the dating market, and they are spreading into every other area that depends on male participation. Birth rates continue to fall because fewer men are willing to take on the long term obligations that come with starting a family under current conditions. Home purchases in certain price ranges have slowed because the dual income model that used to support those purchases is less common among the age groups that traditionally bought homes. Consumer spending patterns have shifted as the group of men who are opting out reduce their spending on status items and on experiences designed to impress. These changes do not make headlines in the same way that dramatic protests or policy fights do, but they accumulate over time into measurable differences in economic activity and in social stability. The women who are feeling the pressure most directly are often the ones who were told they would never need to compete on the same terms as men, because the system would continue to adjust in their favor. That adjustment has limits, and those limits are being reached at the same moment that male willingness to subsidize has declined. The combination creates a situation where the old coping mechanisms no longer work and the new ones have not yet been developed at scale. Men who have already made the transition to independence are not spending their time gloating or organizing campaigns. They are focused on the next skill or the next improvement to their routine because that focus is what protects the peace they have gained. They are not interested in re entering environments where their contributions are treated as baseline expectations and where any shortfall is framed as moral failure. They have seen what happens when they pour energy into those environments and they have decided the return is not worth the investment. This is not a temporary phase that will reverse when the economy improves or when cultural messaging softens. It is a structural change in how one half of the population calculates risk and reward in relationships and in society at large. The other half is still operating on the older calculation, and the mismatch produces the visible friction that shows up in comment sections and in personal conversations. Until the calculations align, again, the gap will continue to widen, and the people who assumed the old alignment would last are the ones who will feel the effects first and most directly. The sobering part is that the consequences are not theoretical and they are not limited to one demographic. Every decision to walk away removes resources and stability from the shared system that everyone still has to live inside. The men who leave are not disappearing from the economy entirely, but they are reallocating their effort away from the areas that used to absorb the shocks for others. That reallocation leaves gaps that public programs were never sized to fill. The women who are now facing those gaps without the old support structures are discovering that resilience is not something that can be summoned on demand after decades of being told it would not be necessary. The skills of budgeting under constraint, of maintaining housing without a second income, of navigating conflict without an automatic ally, and of planning across multiple years without assuming external rescue are all learnable. The difficulty is that learning them under pressure is harder than learning them in advance, and the window for advanced preparation has already closed for large numbers of people. The men who walked away learned those skills because the alternative was continuing to accept conditions that were becoming unsustainable. The women who are now in the same position have the same choice in front of them, but the starting point is different and the emotional adjustment required is larger because the cultural story they were given did not include this outcome as a possibility. What comes next is not a return to the previous balance, but an acceleration of the split that already exists. Men who are already independent will continue to refine their arrangements because each improvement reinforces the decision they made. Women who are still hoping for a reversal will continue to experience the gap between expectation and reality until the gap becomes impossible to ignore. Some will adapt by developing the same skills of self reliance that the men already practice. Others will continue to look for external solutions that no longer exist at the scale required. The economy will keep applying pressure because inflation and stagnant wage growth in many sectors are not temporary features, but ongoing conditions that reward preparation and punish the lack of it. The social media landscape will continue to amplify the most visible reactions because those reactions drive engagement. The quieter work of actual adaptation will happen off camera, in apartments, and in small routines that do not generate content. That quieter work is where the real story of the next decade will be written, and the people who are already practicing it are the ones who will determine how much of the old system survives and how much has to be rebuilt from different assumptions. The men who walked away are not waiting for permission or for conditions to improve. They are already living inside the new assumptions, and they are not interested in trading that stability for a return to arrangements that no longer serve them. That choice is now a fixed part of the landscape, and everyone else is adjusting to it, whether they wanted to or not. The pattern is repeating across age groups and across regions because the underlying incentives are the same everywhere. A man who can cover his own needs with less effort than it takes to maintain, but a relationship that adds net stress will choose the lower effort path. A woman who was told that path would not be available is now discovering that it is not only available, but increasingly common. The surprise is understandable because the cultural messaging never included this scenario as a likely outcome. The messaging focused on what women could gain by stepping away from traditional expectations, and it did not spend equal time on what would happen if men applied the same logic to their own participation. That asymmetry in messaging created an asymmetry in preparation. Men who absorbed the message that their contributions were undervalued responded by reducing those contributions. Women who absorbed the message that support would remain available did not build equivalent backup systems at the same rate. The result is visible in the different levels of daily stress and in the different timelines for recovery when economic pressure arrives. One group tightens an already lean routine and keeps moving. The other group experiences the pressure as a sudden loss of options because the options they counted on were never fully under their own control. Closing that gap in preparation is possible, but it requires accepting that the old external supports are no longer reliable and that the work of building internal ones cannot be postponed any longer. The larger society is already feeling the effects in ways that are hard to reverse quickly. Marriage rates have declined because fewer people see the arrangement as a net positive under current conditions. Birth rates have followed because family formation requires a level of long term confidence that many no longer possess. Consumer patterns have shifted because the households that used to drive certain categories of spending are smaller and more cautious. These are not temporary adjustments that will snap back when sentiment improves. They are structural responses to incentives that have been consistent for years. The men who walked away did not do so because of a single election or a single economic report. They did so because the cumulative weight of cultural messaging and changing legal and financial realities made the old path less rational than the new one. Reversing that calculation would require more than surface level changes. It would require restoring genuine mutual value in the relationships that men are currently opting out of. Until that value is restored, the walk-away pattern will continue, and the consequences will continue to land on the people who were least prepared to absorb them. The economy will keep testing everyone, but it will test the unprepared more harshly because they have fewer internal resources to fall back on. The men who already made the transition have those resources because they built them, while the option to rely on external support was still being promoted as permanent. That difference in timing is now the difference between managing pressure and being managed by it. The future that is forming is one where self reliance is no longer optional for large parts of the population. The people who treat it as optional are the ones who will feel each new round of economic pressure as a crisis rather than as another data point to adjust around. Men who walked away have already made that adjustment and they are not interested in reversing it because the alternative they left behind no longer exists in the form they were sold. Women who are still operating on the older map are discovering that the terrain has changed and that the landmarks they were given no longer match what is actually in front of them. The process of updating the map is painful when it happens under time pressure and without the buffer that previous generations took for granted. Some will make the update and will join the group that already practices the skills of independence. Others will continue to search for the old landmarks and will experience repeated disappointment when those landmarks fail to appear. The economy does not negotiate and it does not wait for cultural stories to catch up with material reality. The men who accepted that fact early are already positioned to weather what comes next. The women who are still hoping the old story will reassert itself are positioned to experience the full force of the mismatch. That difference is not going away, and it is not going to be solved by anyone other than the individuals who decide to close it for themselves. The choice is available to anyone willing to accept the terms that are actually on offer rather than the terms that were promised in an earlier chapter. The men who walked away accepted those terms and built accordingly. The question that remains is how many others will do the same before the cost of waiting becomes higher than the cost of beginning. The reality that is settling in now is that this walk away is reshaping the foundations of how communities function. Because when half the population removes itself from the traditional support structures, everything downstream starts to shift in visible ways. Children who grow up in environments where one parent has already opted out learn different lessons about what relationships look like and what they cost. They see the calculation being made in real time rather than hearing the old stories about how things are supposed to work. That exposure changes expectations for the next generation because they are not inheriting the same assumptions about automatic provision or automatic partnership. They learn early that stability comes from personal capability rather than from hoping another person will carry the load. This is not a loss in the abstract sense, but a hard reset that forces everyone involved to confront what actually produces long term security. The women who find themselves navigating this new landscape without the expected partners are discovering that the independence they were sold requires more than slogans and career titles. It requires the ability to generate consistent income under pressure and the discipline to live within means that do not expand with every new desire. Many are learning these lessons late, and the tuition is paid in sleepless nights and mounting obligations that cannot be deferred. The state programs that were meant to bridge the gap are stretched thin because the number of people needing them has grown, while the number of people funding them through traditional channels has contracted. That imbalance cannot be fixed by printing more promises or by shaming the men who left the system, because the men who left are no longer listening to the shaming. They have tuned out the noise and focused on the quiet work of building something that belongs to them alone. Look at the way daily life has changed for the men who made the decision early. They wake up in spaces they control completely. There is no negotiation over how the money is spent or where the time goes. They eat food that fuels their bodies rather than food chosen to satisfy someone else's preferences. They train their bodies because strength is no longer optional when there is no one else to call for help. They study markets or code or trades because knowledge translates directly into options that cannot be taken away by someone else's mood. The peace they describe is not the absence of all problems, but the absence of problems created by trying to manage another adult who does not share the same priorities. This peace compounds over months and years because each decision reinforces the next one. Savings grow when there is only one set of expenses. Energy levels stay higher when there is no constant emotional labor required to keep another person satisfied. Opportunities appear because the schedule is not dictated by someone else's calendar or someone else's crises. The men who live this way are not isolated hermits hiding from the world. They maintain friendships and professional networks that serve mutual benefit rather than obligation. They contribute where it makes sense, but they no longer contribute out of guilt or cultural pressure that has proven hollow. This model works because it aligns with observable outcomes rather than with ideals that never matched reality. The women watching from the outside often misread this as bitterness or fear when it is actually the opposite. It is the calm that comes from no longer fighting a battle that cannot be won on the old terms. The hard truth that keeps surfacing is that nature does not care about modern narratives or about feelings of entitlement. When resources become scarce, the competition returns to basic principles of capability and preparation. Women who spent years in environments that rewarded appearance or social skills over practical competence are now competing in arenas where those advantages carry less weight. The job market does not adjust salaries based on gender expectations when profits are under pressure. Housing costs do not decrease because a single person needs the same square footage as a couple. Food prices do not drop because one person is trying to stretch a budget that was built around dual incomes. The women who are adapting are the ones who are learning these realities quickly and making the necessary cuts to their lifestyles. They are downsizing living spaces and transportation and entertainment because the math demands it. They are building skills that produce income rather than skills that produce attention, because attention does not pay the bills when the attention span of the culture moves on to the next trend. The ones who resist this learning curve are the ones posting about the unfairness of it all while the bills continue to arrive on schedule. That resistance does not change the numbers. It only delays the point at which the adjustment finally happens, and the delay makes the adjustment more painful. The men who walked away already completed their adjustment, and they are not available to soften the landing for anyone else. They learned the lesson that protecting someone from consequences ultimately delays their growth, and they have chosen not to repeat that mistake. Society as a whole is experiencing the ripple effects in the form of slower growth in certain sectors and faster growth in others. Industries that relied on the spending of dual income households or on the consumption patterns of people trying to impress potential partners are seeing different numbers. The men who are minimalist by choice buy tools and equipment that last rather than items that signal status. They invest in experiences that build capability rather than experiences that create content. This shift in spending power influences what businesses prioritize and what products succeed. Meanwhile, the women who are adjusting are becoming more selective in their own consumption because every dollar has to work harder. The overall economy does not collapse from this, but it reorients in ways that reward different behaviors. The people who saw the reorientation coming and prepared for it are positioned to benefit. The people who denied it until it was obvious are catching up from behind. The sobering part is that catching up from behind in a tightening economy means accepting lower standards for longer periods. It means learning to live with less while watching others who prepared live with more freedom. That gap in lived experience is what fuels the visible frustration on social platforms, but the frustration does not rewrite the underlying math. The math favors preparation, and it favors the people who stopped waiting for external rescue. The psychological dimension is just as important as the financial one, because the mind has to accept the new reality before the actions can follow. Men who walked away had to grieve the old vision of partnership and family that they were raised with. They had to accept that the version of success sold to them required sacrifices that no longer delivered the promised rewards. Once that acceptance happened, the mental energy that was previously spent on maintaining impossible standards became available for other uses. They redirected it toward mastery of their own domains and toward building routines that support long term health. The calm that results is noticeable because it is not forced. It comes from alignment between daily choices and actual outcomes. Women who are encountering the same reality later are going through a similar grieving process, but without the same cultural permission to do so. The narrative still encourages them to blame external forces rather than to examine their own role in creating the conditions. That blame delays the acceptance and therefore delays the redirection of energy. The women who break through that delay and accept the terms as they exist are the ones who start building their own version of independence. They develop the same focus on capability and the same willingness to cut what does not serve. The process is harder when it happens under financial pressure, but it is still possible, and the ones who complete it report the same increase in personal control that the men discovered earlier. Policy responses have tried to address the symptoms without touching the root causes, and the results have been predictably limited. Programs that increase assistance without requiring corresponding changes in behavior create dependency that grows faster than the funding can sustain. Messages that shame men for opting out ignore the reasons those men made the choice and therefore fail to bring them back. Attempts to legislate relationship behavior through family courts or through workplace rules only increase the incentive for men to avoid those systems entirely. The smarter approach would be to recognize that the incentives have changed permanently and to adjust expectations accordingly. Encourage both sides to develop real self reliance rather than promising that one side will continue to subsidize the other. Teach young people the actual costs of the lifestyles they see promoted online rather than the filtered versions. Measure success by sustainable outcomes rather than by temporary feelings of empowerment. These changes would align policy with reality, but they require admitting that the previous direction was based on incomplete information. The admission is difficult because it challenges the foundational stories of the past several decades. Without the admission, the policies continue to produce the same mismatch between promise and delivery. The men who walked away are not waiting for the policies to catch up. They are living outside the old incentive structure, and they are better for it. The global picture shows the same patterns repeating in different cultures because the underlying economic and technological forces are similar everywhere. Urbanization and digital connectivity have made the costs of mismatched expectations more visible across borders. Men in various countries are reaching the same conclusion that the traditional provider role no longer offers proportional benefits. They are choosing smaller footprints and greater control over their time. Women in those same countries are facing higher costs of living and fewer reliable partners willing to absorb those costs. The countries that adapt by encouraging genuine mutual investment will see better stability. The ones that double down on the old imbalances will see faster fragmentation. Technology accelerates the process because it gives people more options for how they earn and how they live. A man with skills that can be performed remotely does not need to stay in a high cost city to maintain his income. A woman who learns the same skills gains the same mobility. The ones who refuse to learn them lose options as the world moves forward. The sobering wake up call is that the world is moving forward whether individuals choose to move with it or not. The men who walked away chose to move with it on their own terms. The women who are still adjusting are learning that the choice is available to them as well if they are willing to make the same hard decisions. What stands out in all of this is the speed with which the new reality solidifies once the decision is made. A man who stops participating in the old game does not spend years looking back. He spends his energy on the next practical step that improves his position. That forward focus creates momentum that is hard to interrupt. The women who reach the same forward focus create their own momentum, and the results show in their stability and in their reduced reliance on external validation. The gap between the two groups narrows only when more people on both sides accept the same terms of self responsibility. Until then, the divide continues, and the stories people tell themselves about why it exists become more elaborate. The truth is simpler than the stories. The old contract required contributions from both sides that were roughly balanced. When the balance shifted too far in one direction, the other side withdrew. Withdrawing was not an act of destruction, it was an act of preservation that allowed the withdrawing side to rebuild on firmer ground. The side that remained is now doing the same rebuilding whether it wanted to or not. The process is uncomfortable, but it is necessary because the previous ground was eroding under the weight of unrealistic expectations. The coming years will test how well each group has prepared for sustained pressure. Inflation does not pause because people need a break. Job markets do not create easy positions because certain lifestyles depend on them. Housing availability does not increase because single adults need more space than they can afford. The tests will be repeated, and the people who treat them as temporary will keep being surprised when the temporary becomes permanent. The men who walked away have stopped being surprised. They have built their lives around the permanent version of reality, and they are thriving within it. They sleep more because their minds are not occupied with managing someone else's chaos. They work less in traditional settings because their income streams are more efficient. They enjoy their days because the days belong to them without constant negotiation. This is not a fantasy version of independence. It is the result of deliberate choices made in response to observable conditions. The women who are making similar deliberate choices are reaching similar results. The ones who are not are the ones still searching for the return of the old conditions. That search is understandable, but it does not change the conditions. The conditions favor the prepared, and the prepared are the ones who accepted the walk-away reality rather than fighting it. The deeper layer that few want to discuss openly is that human relationships have always involved trade offs, and the current environment has made some of those trade offs more expensive than others. Men discovered that the emotional and financial trade offs required for the old style of relationship were no longer balanced by the benefits provided. They adjusted by reducing their exposure to those trade offs. Women are now discovering that the trade offs of complete independence include full responsibility for every area of life without the shared load that used to exist. Both discoveries are painful in their own way, but both are necessary for growth. The growth happens when people stop expecting the world to adjust to their preferences and start adjusting their preferences to the world as it exists. The men who walked away completed that adjustment. The women who are in the middle of it are learning that the adjustment is possible even if it arrives later than they would have preferred. The children watching the process are learning that relationships are not guaranteed outcomes, but negotiated realities that require ongoing work from both sides. That lesson is one of the most valuable ones they can receive because it prepares them for a world that no longer hides the costs. The intensity of the current moment comes from the collision between old expectations and new realities. The old expectations were built during periods of relative abundance and stable social norms. The new realities are shaped by tighter resources and fluid norms that reward adaptability over entitlement. The collision produces friction that shows up in personal lives and in larger social trends. The men who removed themselves from the collision point found smoother ground. The women who are still in the middle of it are feeling every bump. The path out of the friction is the same for both. Accept the terms, build capability, reduce waste, focus on what works rather than on what used to work. The men who did this first have a head start, But the race is not over. Anyone who starts now can still reach a position of control. The ones who refuse to start will fall further behind as the pressure continues. The pressure is not going away because the economic and technological forces driving it are still accelerating. The only question left is how many people will choose the path of preparation before the cost of delay becomes too high to recover from. The men who walked away chose early. The rest are choosing now, one decision at a time. Every indicator points to continued separation between the group that has internalized self reliance and the group that is still hoping for rescue. The separation is not spiteful, it is mechanical. People who operate on different sets of assumptions naturally sort into different lifestyles. The men who assume they must provide for themselves build accordingly. The women who eventually reach the same assumption build accordingly. The transition period is where the discomfort lives because the assumptions have not yet aligned across the board. During that period, the visible stories are the ones of struggle and the ones of quiet success. The quiet success stories do not make as much noise, but they are multiplying because the path to them is straightforward once the decision is made. Live within your means, develop marketable skills, protect your time and your energy, cut obligations that do not return value. These principles work for anyone who applies them consistently. The men who walked away applied them, and the results followed. The women who apply them now will see results follow as well. The difference is only in the starting point and in the willingness to accept that the old starting point no longer exists. The world has moved on, and the people who move with it will determine the shape of the next chapter. The raw fact remains that nature rewards competence and preparation over feelings of fairness. When the environment tightens, the competent and prepared maintain their position while others scramble to catch up. The men who walked away positioned themselves as competent and prepared by removing the variables they could not control. They kept what they could control and optimized it. The women facing the same environment have the same opportunity to optimize what they control. Some are taking it and some are not. The ones who are not are the ones who will tell the loudest stories about how difficult the times have become. The ones who are taking it are the ones who will simply live better lives without needing to explain themselves. The society that emerges from this sorting will be different from the one that existed before. It will have clearer lines between those who can stand on their own and those who still require external support. It will value skills that produce results over skills that produce attention. It will measure relationships by mutual benefit rather than by cultural ideals that no longer match the ground. That society is already forming around the choices people make today. The men who walked away helped form it by their absence from the old structures. The women who adapt will help form it by their presence in the new ones. The rest will watch from the sidelines until they decide to join one side or the other. The intensity of the change can feel overwhelming when viewed all at once, but it breaks down into individual decisions that anyone can make. Decide to learn a skill that pays. Decide to live in a space you can afford without help. Decide to protect your schedule from people who drain more than they add. Decide to measure your success by your own standards rather than by external applause. Each decision builds on the last and creates the momentum that turns survival into stability and stability into freedom. The men who walked away made those decisions, and the freedom followed. The women who are making them now are seeing the same pattern emerge. The gap that exists between the two groups is closing for the ones who choose action over complaint. The ones who choose complaint are widening the gap for themselves because complaint does not generate income or reduce expenses. It only consumes time that could have been used for productive steps. The sobering part is that time is the one resource that cannot be recovered once it is spent. The men who walked away stopped spending their time on unproductive battles. The women who want similar freedom will stop spending theirs the same way. The world does not owe anyone a soft landing, but it does reward the people who build their own. The future belongs to the people who understand that the old social contract has been renegotiated by reality itself. The renegotiation did not happen in a boardroom or in a courtroom. It happened in millions of individual calculations about what is worth the effort and what is not. The men who performed that calculation and chose to walk away have lived with the consequences and found them preferable to the alternative. The women who perform the same calculation will reach similar conclusions if they are honest with the numbers. The numbers show that self reliance is the only reliable path when external support becomes unreliable. The men learned that lesson ahead of the curve. The women are learning it on the curve. The children will learn it as the default because they are growing up inside the new reality. That default is harsher in some ways, but it is also more honest. It forces capability rather than promising protection that cannot be delivered. It rewards work that produces rather than work that signals. It aligns daily life with actual outcomes instead of with cultural fantasies. The alignment may feel raw at first, but it produces results that last because they are built on truth rather than on wishful thinking. The men who walked away chose truth. The rest of society is catching up to that choice, but one person at a time. This is the wake up call that keeps repeating in different forms. The world has changed. The old promises no longer match the new conditions. The people who adjust their expectations and their actions to fit the new conditions will navigate the pressure with less damage. The people who cling to the old promises will feel every part of the mismatch. The men who walked away adjusted early, and the adjustment has paid off in peace and in progress. The women who adjust now will see the same payoff. The divide that exists is temporary for those willing to cross it through deliberate effort. For those unwilling, the divide becomes permanent and the consequences compound. The choice is individual, but the outcomes are visible to everyone. The visible outcomes show that the path of self reliance works. It works for the men who took it first, and it will work for anyone who takes it now. The fire in the current moment is the friction of transition, but the fire also forges stronger individuals on both sides. The stronger individuals are the ones who will shape what comes after the transition. They are the ones who accepted the terms as they are and built lives that stand on their own. The rest are still negotiating with terms that no longer exist. The negotiation ends when the reality becomes impossible to deny, and for increasing numbers of people, that point has already arrived. The ones who arrive at it now have the advantage of seeing the path that others have already cleared. The path is clear. The work is straightforward. The results follow for anyone who does the work. The path is clear. The work is straightforward. The results follow for anyone who does the work. What remains is the recognition that this moment represents a permanent fork in the road for how individuals relate to each other and to the larger systems around them. The fork did not appear suddenly, but emerged from accumulated decisions over years, where one side kept demanding more while offering less in return, and the other side finally stopped agreeing to the imbalance. The men who took the walkaway route did not do it lightly. They weighed the evidence of repeated patterns and chose the option that preserved their sanity and their resources. That choice has proven durable because it rests on observable cause and effect rather than on hope that the patterns would magically reverse. The women now confronting the same evidence have the same opportunity to make a durable choice. They can continue expecting the world to revert to the old script, or they can write a new script based on the actual conditions they face. The new script demands honesty about capabilities and limitations. It requires building reserves instead of relying on future promises. It values competence in practical matters over competence in signaling virtue. The women who embrace this new script are already showing up with clearer priorities and stronger personal boundaries. They are learning to generate their own security instead of waiting for it to be provided. They are cutting expenses that no longer serve survival and investing in skills that produce independence. The transformation is not glamorous in the beginning, but it becomes its own reward as the sense of control grows with each completed step. The fire in this transition is the discomfort of letting go of the old map, but that same fire refines the people who walk through it into versions of themselves that can stand regardless of what the economy or the culture throws next. Society will look different on the other side of this sorting process because the old assumptions about automatic pairing and automatic provision have been stress tested and found wanting. Communities that once relied on high marriage rates and stable family units to distribute responsibilities are seeing those rates decline and the distribution of responsibilities shift toward individual shoulders. This shift creates challenges in areas like elder care and child rearing, where the shared load used to make the burden manageable. The challenges force innovation in how people organize their lives. Some form intentional groups based on mutual values rather than romantic expectation. Others focus on extended family networks that prioritize capability over tradition. The common thread is that participation becomes voluntary and based on demonstrated contribution rather than on cultural guilt. The men who walked away pioneered this voluntary model by removing themselves from arrangements that demanded contribution without equivalent return. The women who adopt similar standards are creating their own voluntary networks that function on the same principle. The result is a social landscape with fewer fragile dependencies and more resilient individuals. The fragility of the old model showed itself when economic pressure revealed how many relationships were held together by financial necessity rather than by genuine alignment. When that necessity decreased for one side, the relationships dissolved at scale. The dissolution was painful, but it cleared space for new alignments based on strength rather than on weakness. The strong alignments that form now will endure because they are chosen freely and maintained through mutual effort rather than through social pressure or legal obligation. The ultimate sobering truth is that nature has always operated on the principle of adaptation or elimination. Those who adapt to changing conditions survive and often thrive. Those who refuse to adapt face elimination from the comfortable positions they once held. The current economic and social conditions represent one of those tests on a mass scale. The test is not fair in the sense of equal starting points, but it is consistent in rewarding the behaviors that match reality. Preparation, discipline, flexibility, and honest self assessment are the behaviors that match the current reality. Entitlement, denial, blame shifting, and reliance on past promises are the behaviors that do not match. The men who walked away demonstrated the first set of behaviors, and they are positioned to pass the test. The women who demonstrate the same set will pass it as well. The divide that exists today is the visible scorecard of who has started the adaptation process and who has not. The scorecard is not permanent for anyone willing to switch sides through action. The fire that burns in the current moment is the heat of that adaptation process. It exposes weaknesses and it strengthens what remains. The people who emerge from the fire will carry the lessons into every future decision they make. They will choose partners or friends based on proven character rather than on potential. They will allocate resources based on long term sustainability rather than on short term comfort. They will measure their days by the peace and capability they build rather than by the validation they receive from others. This shift in measurement changes everything because it aligns daily life with outcomes that can actually be controlled. The closing chapter of this era will be written by the individuals who refuse to let the old stories dictate their future. They looked at the data of rising costs and declining trust, and they made the hard calls that preserved their future options. The men who did this first created the template. The women who are doing it now are filling in the details with their own experiences and their own strengths. Together, they are demonstrating that the walk away was not the end of connection, but the beginning of connection on honest terms. Honest terms mean no more pretending that one side owes the other endless subsidies. Honest terms mean no more ignoring the contributions that actually sustain a household or a society. Honest terms mean accountability for choices and celebration of results rather than excuses for failures. The world that operates on honest terms is rawer than the world of polite fictions, but it is also more alive because it rewards real effort and real character. The men who embraced it found peace in the rawness. The women who embrace it will find the same peace. The children who grow up in it will take it as normal, and they will build even stronger versions because they never learned the old fictions in the first place. That is the legacy that is forming. It is not the legacy of collapse that some fear. It is the legacy of reset and renewal that comes when people finally align their actions with the truth of their situation. The intensity of the message lands because the stakes are personal for every listener. Your daily life will reflect the choices you make in response to this reality. Ignore it, and the pressure will compound until it forces the issue. Face it directly, and the pressure becomes fuel for the changes that protect your peace and your progress. The men who walked away faced it directly, and their lives improved measure by measure. The women who face it directly will see the same improvement. The fire is here to separate what is sustainable from what is not. Let it do its work. Let it burn away the illusions that no longer serve. Let it reveal the core of what actually works. What works is ownership of your own outcomes. What works is building skills that pay their own way. What works is living within means that you control. What works is choosing relationships that add rather than subtract. What works is accepting the world as it is rather than demanding that it return to what it was. The men who walked away accepted the world as it is, and they are living proof that acceptance leads to freedom. The final call is for everyone still listening to make the same acceptance. Do the work, build the life, claim the peace. The road is open for those willing to walk it. The old road is closed for good. The choice has always been yours, but the consequences of delay are growing heavier with each passing month. Choose wisely. Choose now. The future you build will be the one that matches the effort you put in. Make the effort count. Make it honest. Make it strong. The results will speak for themselves in the quiet satisfaction of days well lived and nights peacefully slept. The 1 hour gang, you made it all the way to the end, and that means you are serious about understanding the shift that is happening around us. If you're enjoying these angry guy videos, you can show your support by buying me a Red Bull using the link in the description of the video. What did you think about what we discussed here? Do you agree with the direction things are heading? Leave a comment on the video and share your thoughts because the conversation matters and your perspective adds to the bigger picture. Like the video if you like it. Do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.